right. Hello and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us here each week to update us on all the events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes and open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I'll turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from Israel. It's been, certainly an eventful week, but it's certainly been a very bad week, or pretty bad week, for Prime Minister Netanyahu. And I'd like to go through some of the events to explain why. Let's start at the end. Obviously, today there were major events. We had riots on the Golan. The Jewish community on the Golan is separate from the Jewish community in the rest of Israel. The rest of Israel, the Jewish community generally is relatively is patriotic, is loyal to Israel, serves in the army, has Zionist youth movements. Anyone who knows Jewish members of Knesset, on the whole, they run for and sit with Zionist parties, even on the right, in the Likud, Yisrael Beitenu. But the Jews on the Golan consider themselves, again, the majority consider themselves Syrian. They don't consider themselves Israeli. They consider themselves occupied. So it's a very different population. Today, after a few years of sort of heightened tensions owed to wind turbines, which are being built on the Golan, there was major riots, some called the Druze Intifada, where basically they tried to break into a police station, into a border patrol police station. Some said that if more troops had not arrived, and in the end there were 1,300 needed, there would have been a lynch. Obviously, we don't know exactly what would have happened because the backup did come, but there were quite a few injuries, both on the side of the police and on the side of the Druze. Ironically, the whole program for wind turbines on the Golan was actually formulated by Druze members themselves. And it seems that maybe it's more political in nature, perhaps more national in nature, perhaps, as was suggested by certain Druze members today. It's the straw that broke the camel's back. But Netanyahu managed to at least call a ceasefire by meeting with the head of the Jewish community, the religious head of the Jewish community. So they basically decided they're going to put it off until after the upcoming festival. So we'll see what happens with that, but certainly it doesn't look good to see what seem to be thousands of Jews rioting on the Golan. Obviously, yesterday we had the terrible terrorist attack, which claimed 4 lives, where 4 Israelis were murdered in a gas station and a hummus restaurant next to the town of Eli. It's just the latest in a relative series of terrorist attacks. It doesn't look good for right-wing government that they are not able to provide security. Today, we saw in response many of the settlers around that area in Yitzhar and other areas try and confront Palestinians in the village where these terrorists came from. There's already been 1 Palestinian who was shot. The Israeli army said that he shot at them and then they shot back. But it remains to be seen exactly what's happening there. But there has been calls for calm, but it's certainly falling on deaf ears by communities who just feel that they've had enough of these terror attacks and they don't feel secure. And obviously, one can imagine the more right-wing members of the government, like Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, were certainly on the scene of the terrorist attack yesterday, calling for all manner of things, and things which, quite frankly, Netanyahu is not prepared to do. In the end, he did announce what the government calls the Zionist response, which is to build 1,000 new homes in Eli in response. But that's certainly not going to placate the more right-wing members of his government. There's been a few other elements which I'll go through within the government, but 2, let's just say, political blows for Netanyahu this week. The first is today there was the election for the head of the Bar Association. Now, one might think that's not such a major deal. And usually in Israel, it's not. It usually goes off without great fanfare. The election is only open to members of the Bar Association, in other words, lawyers. But it's fraught with tension because of the makeup of the Judicial Appointment Committee. And as we know, that is one of the central aspects that this right-wing government would like to reform. They would like to give themselves a majority on that committee. They feel that they are the elected government and they should be allowed to elect more justices, more in line with their thinking. Why this was crucial is because the Israel Bar Association, out of 9 members of that selection panel, represent 2 votes. Now, 2 votes is, again, it's not that much, but it could be crucial. If the government is trying to get a majority to push through certain justices, those 2 votes could be crucial. And the 2 main candidates were billed as being one from the government or representing the government's interest and more right-wing and more in line with judicial reform, and one certainly against it. And the one who won it by a landslide was against the government reform. It was really 3-1. I think the election results came in. They're not absolutely confirmed, but it was a landslide. And that's a bit of a blow. While it wouldn't have rectified the long-standing problems on the Judicial Appointment Committee for the right-wing government, it certainly could have made the whole process a lot simpler, which leads us to probably, arguably, politically, the biggest blow for Netanyahu, which happened at the end of last week, where basically there was a vote to elect the 2 members of Knesset to the panel. It is usually traditional. One comes from the opposition, one comes from the coalition. There was talk of maybe ignoring the opposition because, quite frankly, the coalition has the numbers to appoint both. And there was talk about a compromise, about basically who's going to be elected. And there were a lot of talks. The opposition for many weeks had been sniping at each other who's going to be their representative. But credit to them, when the hour came, they actually all agreed on one candidate, Karen El-Harrar, and she was put up to vote. On the other side, there was no such conformity or unity, and there were originally as many as 9 and 10 candidates for the coalition. In the end, they all were persuaded to drop out, and only one, Tali Gottlieb, a new member of Knesset, who very much came in as a strong supporter of Netanyahu, strong supporter of judicial reform, but has soured that relationship with Netanyahu recently and has even called him all sorts of names, even publicly. She refused to back out of the race. What was pointed out to Netanyahu, because he wanted a bit more time on this, he wanted to give negotiations more of a chance, and he didn't want the election, because once the 2 members of Knesset are elected, there's more pressure to actually have the Judicial Committee sit, and that's something that Yoav Levin, the Justice Minister, doesn't want to see at this point, because once it sits, then it can elect justices, and its current composition, it would elect more anti-government, let's say, or more left-wing, as the right-wing would have it. So what was pointed out to Netanyahu is that if neither are voted in by Simcha Rotman, ironically, then they would have to have another election in a month. So the word got out, don't elect either Karen El-Harrar or Gottlieb. What actually conspired was Gottlieb got very few votes, maybe 12, and Karen El-Harrar got a majority. What this means is that at least 4, perhaps more, Likud members of Knesset not openly, secretly, because it is a secret ballot. It's one of the few secret ballots in the Knesset, but secretly basically decided to go against Netanyahu. That was a big blow because he was hoping both votes would fail and then he'd be able to recall another election in a month's time. But the fact that Karen El-Harrar got her majority, obviously with the help of at least 4 members of the coalition, it could be more because it could be some members of the opposition who wanted to play games. And there is talk that Yisrael Beitenu decided not to vote for El-Harrar just to sort of embarrass Netanyahu. Perhaps they say it could be as much as 10 Likud voters, members of Knesset, voted against what Netanyahu wanted. So it was a big blow to see Karen El-Khara get voted, and now she has a seat on the selection panel, and there's no one at this point in time from the coalition. So the vote will come up at some point for a coalition member, but obviously it's certainly a big blow, not just the fact that Netanyahu wasn't able to put it off, but the fact that he now has a small cadre, perhaps larger than he thinks, perhaps smaller, of Likud MKs who basically do not listen to Netanyahu. And that's a bit of a problem. Again, if you add to that, you have Tali Gottlieb and the 12 members of the coalition who voted for her, you can actually say there's an even greater number, because Gottlieb was supposed to get no votes. Again, it could be the opposition were trying to embarrass Netanyahu and voted for Gottlieb just to embarrass him. But it's probably more likely that 12 members of the more populist camp within the Likud, which Tali Gottlieb certainly is part of that, again, openly thumb their nose at the prime minister and what he needed to get forward with his particular agenda. So it's been a very, very difficult week for Netanyahu. It's clear that there are some members of the Likud who are not happy with Netanyahu. As I said, Gottlieb, when she was not elected and she realized she got so few votes, really came out openly sniping Netanyahu. The kind of comments which are rarely heard of openly within the Likud. Moreover, beyond the Likud, in the coalition, we now have open sniping between Shas and Itamar Ben-Gvir's party, Otzma Yehudit. Each of them calling the other's failure. I think a Shas, a sort of unnamed source, which it's highly unlikely an unnamed source would come out from Shas without the approval of leader Aryeh Deri, called Itamar Ben-Gvir the most failed minister in the history of the state. And they were just sort of sniping back and forth. Much of it is not really about politics. It's not about their positions ideologically. It's really about an upcoming fight for who's going to be named chief rabbis. As we know in Israel, there's two chief rabbis, Sephardi and Ashkenazi. It used to be at least one was from the national religious camp and one was from the ultra-Orthodox camp. But today, the ultra-Orthodox parties believe that both of them are theirs. The Deri Shas camp wants either Aryeh Deri's brother or one of the other sons, the brother of the current chief rabbi, another son of Rav Avadia Yosef. And that's very much Shas's want. Ben-Gvir wants someone from his camp, from the national religious camp. There's even been talk of one of his ministers' uncles or father. So there's really a bit of a problem there, because when it comes to religious appointments, the ultra-Orthodox really do believe very much that they have the monopoly on it. And Itamar Ben-Gvir, at this point, perhaps with the backing of Bezalel Smotrich, certainly not accepting it. Going back to judicial reform, what appeared to be happening is the talks at the president's house have been put on hold. The opposition said it won't come back until certain demands have been met. One of them is that the judicial panel is populated completely, that it meets, that it's working, and that none of the legislation is moved forward. Now, that last one is certainly being put to the test, because it seems that the reasonableness legislation is now going to be put back on the table. It was supposed to be this week. Ostensibly, Netanyahu put it off because of the terrorist attack in Eli, but it's probably also to do with other factors as well. Aryeh Deri, for example, it now appears is accepting the fact that he may not be able to return to government. Don't forget, he was disbarred from sitting in government because of this reasonableness. Reasonableness, again, it's a very complicated legal term in Israel, but basically it allows the Supreme Court to overrule either a government decision or a government appointment because they believe that it is unreasonable. Aryeh Deri, because of his prior convictions and his plea bargain, it was considered unreasonable that he should be allowed as a minister, especially after he agreed. Again, this is what opponents of Aryeh Deri say, that he agreed not to return to politics immediately, which he then did. But the reasonableness clause actually has two elements. One is reasonableness against government decisions, and one is against government appointments. It does appear that the opposition is quite prepared to allow the reasonableness clause to be dropped as part of the judicial reform and part of the negotiations on government decisions, because they understand also it's a bit unfair to basically stop a government decision on something as vague as the concept of reasonableness. But they did not agree, and they're against getting rid of the reasonableness clause against government appointments, partly because they want to use this against Aryeh Deri. And they said, if that moves forward, then that's a big problem. The question is which part will move forward, if both or not? That remains to be seen. Moving on to sort of regional matters, Israel is certainly, again, this is a bit of a blow for Netanyahu. Israel is certainly doesn't seem like it's able to affect or cancel or stop or prevent or whatever it is, the new incoming Iran deal. Now, it's not the JCPOA, it's what's called less for less. It's far less it's far smaller in nature. And in fact, the Americans will not call it an agreement because there's apparently a law or stipulation or something which says that any agreement with Iran has to be brought before Congress. So the Biden administration doesn't want to have to do that. So it's not calling it an agreement, it's more of an understanding or something like that. Regardless of this, Israel is certainly against it, and it doesn't seem like Netanyahu and his government has been able or will be able to stop it. The final thing that came out today, which again is a blow for Netanyahu and a right-wing government, which claims to bring security and be strong on defense issues, is the remarkable revelation that Hezbollah has set up for the last 2 weeks, 2 tents on Israeli territory. Now, it's in the Mount Dov region, which is in the far north of the Golan. It's an area which is claimed not just by Lebanon, but also Syria. According to the blue line that the UN wrote, it is within Israel territory, but obviously Hezbollah, Lebanon, and Syria feel differently. But the fact that Hezbollah were able to set up mere meters, granted, but still able to set up 2 tents within Israel territory, they've been sitting there for 2 weeks. The IDF claims that it's not really a problem from a security point of view, but Israel, again, hasn't taken the steps to remove it at this point. They're saying that they want to do it through diplomacy. They want to do it through the UN, through UNIFIL, and if necessary, they will use force. But the fact that an enemy organization has set up a post, call it a command post if you like, whatever it is, within Israel territory, and it has been left up until this point unaltered, is certainly a blow to someone who claims to, a government which claims to take a strong stance on security matters. So it hasn't been the best week for Netanyahu on many, many different fields. He still has a relatively stable government because the budget's been passed, and there's no real way at this point to break up the government short of a vote to disband it, which isn't going to happen. And we have to remember that the more right-wing elements, though they may talk a lot, they don't really have anywhere to go politically. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you so much. So the first one is, does the Supreme Court have any other means to shoot down a legislation law aside from this reasonableness clause?
Yes, absolutely. They do. They have many ways. And that's the whole point, that the government, those in favor of reform, want to be able to overrule the Supreme Court, override. It's called the override clause, which would override the ruling against the government. That is another element of the judicial reform. That is probably, arguably, the most controversial, because that basically takes away the main authority of the Supreme Court in looking at the government decisions and deciding whether they pass the test of the constitutional test, which is largely looking at the basic laws of Israel have, which are sort of a quasi-constitution, and deciding whether this particular law contravenes the basic law. That the proponents of judicial reform say that is a power that the Supreme Court took for themselves. There's anywhere that they were ever given that power, but they decided with the Aaron Barak revolution that they would take that on themselves. And so far it's been untested. The question would be is if they try and pass this override law and the Supreme Court overrules that, then we're in a constitutional, we're in a real constitutional quandary at that point.
Thank you. So Arnold asks, what is or are the specific problems with the judiciary that are alleged to require reform?
Well, speaking in larger terms, the right-wing religious camp believe they simply haven't been represented because this judicial appointment committee is so weighted to the judicial system. It basically self-perpetuates itself. It brings in people from similar backgrounds, from similar worldviews, and there's a belief that regardless of who gets elected, this is what the proponents of judicial reform would say, regardless of who the people elect, having the Supreme Court or allowing the Supreme Court to overrule and decide on decisions, on government decisions, on laws, on appointments, government appointments, allows the will of the people to be overruled. And they say that we need a more balanced Supreme Court. They would point to the fact that there's only a tiny percentage of Supreme Court justices over the years have been from a non-Ashkenazi background, whereas actually non-Ashkenazi Jews make up the majority in Israel. They would say that there's not enough right-wing or conservative in the American parlance Supreme Court justices. Perhaps there's not enough minorities like Arabs. Perhaps there's not enough minorities like as women or others. They say that it's basically the same type of person again and again and again. And regardless of the will of the people, the Supreme Court has placed itself above the legislature, the democratically elected legislature, and basically can overrule the will of the people. This is what the proponents of government judicial reform claim.
Thank you. JL asks, is the reason for all this turmoil for Netanyahu because he has shown a weak response to the voters and Knesset members who put him into office, especially with respect to so many security issues lately and with respect to his lack of forward movement on judicial reform?
There's a number of issues. First of all, we must remember that Netanyahu has ruled for many, many years. But if you look at every single other government, apart from his first during the 90s, but that was a different time, a different makeup, all the other governments since 2009, apart from the 1 year he was out of power, he's had a left or left of center component to his government, whether it was Benny Gantz, whether it was Tzipi Livni, whether it was Ehud Barak, or others. He's always had that center-left party, which has allowed him to sort of vacillate left and right and sort of blame the left-wing elements. Today, for the first time, Netanyahu is the most left-wing element within his own party. And Netanyahu, it's a very uncomfortable place for him to be. And he's dealing with real ideologues who, some of them, like Itamar Ben-Gvir, it's their first time ever in government. And even, they're relatively new to the political scene in so much as Itamar Ben-Gvir hasn't been sitting in the Knesset for 10 years. So he's got people who have a more extreme voter base, who needs to play to that base, who needs to find answers for the questions that his voter base are asking them. You've got a renewed appetite from the ultra-Orthodox demands. Today we heard even more demands from the ultra-Orthodox parties. There was a comment came out from one of the ultra-Orthodox members of Knesset who said that the LGBTQ community is more dangerous to Israel than Hamas and Hezbollah. These are the kind of comments which he's daily having to put down. He's having to criticize. He's having to say this doesn't represent the government. But these voices are increasing. Now, some say that Netanyahu is responsible for this because he created this populist base, that he brought the likes of Tali Gottlieb to the table and some of the others. And he's now reaping, the results of it. But certainly Netanyahu, the one thing he wants above everything is calm and stability. Now, as I said at the end of my remarks, he has them overall because he knows for at least 2023 and 24, there's no budget that needs to be passed. So that's a year and a half where it's very difficult to bring down the government. But on the other hand, there almost isn't a day where he isn't putting out fires, either from members of the government or between other members of the government, because there really seems to be no love lost between the various components of the government or even within the Likud. We heard stories of a Likud meeting today, this week, and some of the comments made at each other, partly because of this background of accusation and suspicion, which were the Likud members who voted for Karen El-Harar on the Judicial Appointments Committee. There's all this aura of suspicion. Who voted? Was it this person? There was questions. Gila Gamliel, maybe she's one. Yuli Edelstein is another. Bitam, maybe he's. And they're all accusing each other. So the sort of language that's going around at the moment is certainly between the different, let's say, wings of the Likud party, are something that Netanyahu certainly wants to do without. But it's hard not to find some blame in the fact that he helped many of these different components into the Likud party.
Thank you so much. Don Sable asks, has there been talk, and if you know, what has it been within military and intelligence circles as to why there has been a surge in terrorist attacks?
It's a good question. Some could argue they smell weakness. Interestingly, at the bottom of the surge in terrorist attacks was actually laid relatively clear in a poll, in an internal Palestinian poll that was conducted on whatever it is, 75 years since what they call the Nakba, which is the creation or establishment of the State of Israel, but what they call the catastrophe. And interestingly enough, which I think it shouldn't be remarkable, but it is I think it's something like 2/3 or 3/4 of Palestinians do not believe that the State of Israel will see its 100th birthday. Now, that's a remarkable thing for many of us to think that, 25, there are people, there is a lot, millions of people believe that the State of Israel will simply not be there in 25 years. They will have defeated it. They will have caused it to crumble, to be destroyed, whatever it is, however that would be. So when you have a population that believes, not just hopes, but actually actively believes that the steps that they are taking by murdering people, by these terrorist attacks and everything, that they are bringing this into more reality, that's a problem. And until that they are disavowed from that belief by whatever means the government takes, which is, as Professor Daniel Pipes, the president of the Middle East Forum, says in his Israel victory concept, is until the Palestinian belief in their in ultimate victory is disavowed and forced from them, this conflict will continue to go on. So the polls this week really do bear that out, that there is a significant majority of Palestinians who believe that they will be ultimately successful. And until the Israeli government takes steps against this, takes active and physical steps, these attacks will simply continue because there is this belief that every attack is bringing them closer to their ultimate victory.
Absolutely. Barak Korkmaz follows up, aside from the Palestinians, do you observe an increased security threat against Israel by Iranian proxies? And if yes, is there a connection between increased foreign threat and opposition on the streets?
I don't think there's necessarily, it could be because there has been mention, someone like Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, who's certainly a devoted watcher of internal Israeli politics, did speak about the weakness that he sees in the divisions in Israeli society around the judicial reform. And he's been watching the demonstrations and the cracks in Israeli society. So it could be there's a part of that. But again, 75 years our enemies have sought Israel's destruction. So there's nothing necessarily new. There certainly are upticks and sort of, troughs in the violence. At the moment, there does seem to be a great willingness to attack Israel. And again, we've seen from Lebanon, from Syria now. We even saw in Egypt, don't forget, not too long ago, there was an Egyptian soldier which crossed the border and murdered two Israeli, I think it was 2 or 3 Israeli soldiers. I mean, that's quite unprecedented. Gaza, again, we see attacks from there. We saw with the Islamic Jihad only a few months ago. Some would argue that some of the steps that Israel is taking, perhaps to allay the international community's concern because of this government's building of settlements, they've decided to agree to an offshore gas rig off Gaza, which, although it is claimed it would give money to the Palestinian Authority, not Hamas, the fact that it is so close to Gaza certainly, it doesn't allay too many fears about that. And some would point to steps like that to show that perhaps these are steps which are being misinterpreted by our enemies as weakness, and perhaps that's also playing into it. That there could be a number of factors.
Well, thank you so much. We've come to the close of our webinar and podcast. Ashley, thank you again for taking time to update us this week.
Thank you.
For our viewers and listeners, please join us Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern for a webinar with Joe Kaufman discussing countering local Islamism. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.